Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 75 years after World War II. You know, the war didn't really end in 1945. Not in Hiroshima, not in Nagasaki. Even long after the last bomber flew home and the surrender papers dried, the damage kept ticking. Silent, invisible, relentless. 75 years later, the atomic bombs dropped during World War II still leave fingerprints on bodies, buildings, land, and memory. These weren't just explosions. They were a turning point that rewired warfare, morality, and survival itself. The moment the world changed forever. On 2 mornings in August 1945, the sun came down early. In less than a second, temperatures reached levels hotter than the surface of the sun. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Shadows of people were burned into stone, not bodies. Shadows. The blast flattened cities, but the shockwave that followed reshaped global power overnight. These were not just the most destructive weapons ever used in war. They were weapons that refused to stop killing once the noise faded. Radiation doesn't care about ceasefires. It doesn't respect surrender. Survivors who carried the blast inside them, those who lived through the initial explosion, were not spared. Many walked away thinking they were lucky, only to fall ill days, weeks, or years later. Hair fell out in clumps. Skin blistered and peeled. Internal bleeding appeared without warning. Radiation sickness rewrote medical textbooks in real time. Decades later, cancer rates, they remained higher than average. Leukemia surged. Thyroid, breast, and lung cancers followed. Children born years after the bomb still showed genetic damage. Survival, well, it came with a lifelong receipt. This is the part history books often whisper about. The bomb didn't stop at impact. It lingered in blood cells, bone marrow, and DNA. Cities that had to learn how to exist again. Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't rebuilt. They were reinvented. For years, people believed nothing would ever grow there again. Crops failed. Soil carried fear. Rain fell black and oily in the days after the blast, carrying radioactive ash into rivers and wells. Water, the most basic survival resource, became poison. And yet, life pushed back. Grass broke through the rubble. Trees sprouted from cracked foundations. Humans returned, not because it was safe, but because it was home. 75 years later, both cities stand rebuilt, modern, and alive. But the ground beneath them remembers. Radiation levels dropped significantly over time, but the psychological weight never fully lifted. Every rebuilt street sits on invisible history. The psychological scars no one escaped. The bombs didn't just scar land and bodies. They scarred minds. Survivors carried guilt for living when others didn't. Children grew up surrounded by silence because many adults couldn't talk about what they saw. Flashbacks, nightmares, fear of illness, fear of having children, fear of the rain. This trauma didn't vanish with time. It was passed down, Generational stress became part of daily life. The bomb created not only survivors, but witnesses who never stopped reliving the moment the sky turned white. Before World War II, destruction had limits. But after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those limits just evaporated. Military strategy changed overnight. Nations no longer planned for victory alone. They planned for extinction. The atomic bomb didn't just end a war. It began a permanent standoff, where survival depended on restraint, fear, and deterrence. The Cold War was born from those mushroom clouds. Shelters, drills, sirens, and, constant anxiety became normal. The bomb taught humanity that winning could mean losing everything. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Once the weapon existed, it could never be uninvented. Lessons written in ash and concrete. 75 years later, the scars teach hard lessons. Radiation doesn't announce itself. You don't hear it coming. You don't feel it until it's too late. Preparedness isn't about toughness. It's about knowledge, distance, shielding, and time. The survivors who lived longest weren't the strongest. They were the ones who understood exposure, avoided contaminated zones, and adapted fast. Another lesson is psychological resilience. Communities that rebuilt together healed better than those that isolated. Shared memory became survival armor. And finally, the biggest lesson of all. Technology without restraint doesn't just change wars. It changes what it means to be human. Why this still matters today. This isn't ancient history. Nuclear weapons still exist. More of them. Faster. Smaller. Deadlier. The scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki aren't warnings carved into stone. They're alarms still ringing. Every discussion about nuclear power, weapons, and warfare traces back to those two cities. And every modern emergency plan borrows lessons learned the hard way in 1945. Ignoring that history doesn't make us safer, but understanding it does. The weight of remembering. 75 years later, the scars remain because, they have to. Forgetting makes repetition easier. Remembering makes restraint possible. The atomic bombs ended World War II, but they also opened a door humanity has honestly been afraid to walk through ever since. A door where power outpaced wisdom. Where survival became, conditional. And that's the real legacy. Not the blast. Not the fireball. But the responsibility. If this story mattered to you, if it made you think, pause, or see history differently, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the Scars of a Global Stormfronts. Share this video. Keep these lessons alive. Because history doesn't just live in the past. It waits to be remembered.